An Emirates Boeing 777 is in serious trouble on its final approach to Dubai International Airport. 300 people cling to their seats as strong gusts shake the plane, preventing it from touching down. Puzzled, the captain decides to go round. But before he can even climb 100 feet, the plane begins to drop. The passengers sense that something is amiss, but in the cockpit, the pilots know that their situation is dire. Will they be able to make it back into the air, or will they come crashing down onto the runway below with catastrophic consequences? This is the story of Emirates Flight 521. It was a clear summer morning in 2016 when 282 passengers boarded an Emirates Boeing 777 in Thiruvananthapuram's airport on the southern tip of India. They were bound for the airline's hub in Dubai, 3.5 hours to the northwest. The majority of the passengers were from India, but a total of 20 different nationalities were represented on board, including some from the United Kingdom, the United States, Turkey, and my own country of Ireland, among others. For many passengers, the flight to Dubai was just a stopover on the way to their final destination. Up in the cockpit, preparing the aircraft for departure, was a 34-year-old captain. He was a UAE national who had been with Emirates for 15 years. He joined the airline's cadet program in 2001, before starting as a first officer on the Airbus A330 in 2004. He began his training on the 777 in 2009 and was promoted to captain in 2015. By this point, he had logged more than 7,000 total hours, over 5,000 of which were on the 777. The captain had been described by colleagues as being a very competent pilot who had settled well into the left seat and who set a nice tone on the flight deck. He would be flying the aircraft for this flight, while the first officer monitored the aircraft and handled the radios. That first officer was 37-year-old Australian national Jeremy Webb. Webb was a rather recent hire at Emirates, having joined the airline 2 years previously. In that time, he had built up over 1,200 hours on the 777, making up a not insignificant portion of his almost 9,000 total hours, which was more experience than the captain. Webb was described as being a competent pilot, with no significant negative comments made by his evaluators during training. The two pilots had never flown together, but they had flown this route before. They were well rested, and both had a spotless safety record. Along with the two pilots and 282 passengers were 16 flight attendants, bringing the grand total to 300 people on board. At around 9:30 local time, the doors were closed and the giant aircraft was pushed back from the gate. The passengers had every reason to think that they were in safe hands, with two experienced pilots at the helm and an airline which had never lost a single aircraft since it first started operating in 1985. But on this day, the unprecedented would happen, as the aircraft made its final approach to Dubai. After a short taxi, Flight 521 lined up on the runway. The captain pushed the massive engines to take off thrust, and within a few moments, the plane was airborne. Not long after takeoff, the captain engaged the autopilot. It would stay in control of the plane until just a few minutes before landing. The pilots climbed straight up to the cruising altitude of 36,000 feet and continued out over the crisp blue Arabian Sea. As the plane climbed, the cabin crew went down the aisles serving food and drinks. The atmosphere was calm on what was one of the shorter routes in the airline's vast network. A few hours later, Flight 521 was flying over Oman and almost reaching the point where it could begin its descent into Dubai. It was now time for the captain to brief the first officer on the approach and landing. The pilots got hold of the latest weather report in Dubai, and it wasn't looking good. Even though it was a clear day in terms of clouds, there was reduced visibility due to dust, and the wind was unpredictable. Given the variable wind conditions, the captain decided to brief an approach both onto runway 12 left and the opposite direction runway 30 left at Dubai. Planes almost always land and take off into the wind. The reason for this is that it uses less runway, giving the pilots more space if something goes wrong. On this afternoon, as the captain briefed the approach, the wind was coming from a direction of 110 degrees at a speed of 15 knots. This was basically a perfect headwind for runway 12 at Dubai. The pilots had calculated the landing speed of the plane to be 147 knots on this day. If there was no wind, an airspeed of 147 knots would mean a ground speed of 147 knots on touchdown. But with this afternoon's 15-knot headwind, on touchdown, Flight 521 would have an airspeed of 147 knots, but a ground speed of 132 knots. and it's a lot easier to stop a plane travelling at 132 knots than it is to stop one travelling at 147 knots, as it would be if there were no wind. Now just flip the situation for a tailwind. An airspeed of 147 knots plus a tailwind of 15 knots gives a ground speed on touchdown of 162 knots. This is very fast and would require the plane to use a lot more runway to stop. For this reason, planes are tightly restricted in terms of how strong a tailwind they can land with. For the 777, this limit is 15 knots. To give a sense of how strict this really is, the limit for crosswinds is 40 knots. So, the pilots, in conjunction with air traffic control, would try their best to land on whichever runway had a headwind. On this afternoon, this would not be easy to arrange. A wind shear warning had just been issued by the country's National Meteorological Centre, which reported moderate wind shear for all runways at Dubai. Wind shear is a sudden change in wind speed or direction over a short distance. It poses a serious threat to aircraft of all sizes, and if the pilots of Flight 521 encountered it during their approach to the runway, they would need to go around immediately. Because Dubai is situated on the coast, it is vulnerable to wind shear arising from a sea breeze. A sea breeze forms during the day, when the sun heats the land faster than it heats the sea. The air over the land gets heated, and as a result, it rises. When it rises, the air over the sea swoops in to take its place. Sea breezes can be very strong during the summer, and can blow at speeds of up to 50 km an hour, or 27 knots. So, expecting that wind shear might be a problem on the approach, the captain briefed the wind shear escape manoeuvre with the first officer. The manoeuvre called for the pilot flying, which in this case was the captain, to press the takeoff go-round button on the throttle levers, check that toga mode was active on the flight mode annunciator, confirm that the throttles advanced to go-round power, retract the speed brakes, monitor the aircraft's performance, and not raise the landing gear or flaps until wind shear was no longer a factor. The procedure also dictated that in the case of severe wind shear, the pilot must be ready to manually push the throttles to go-round power rather than trusting the autopilot to do it. During the manoeuvre, the pilot monitoring, in this case First Officer Webb, was required to ensure that maximum thrust had been set, to verify that all of the required actions had been completed, and to call out any omissions by the captain. With the briefing complete, Flight 521 began its descent towards Dubai. The passengers were unaware of all of this as they fastened their seatbelts and settled in for landing. All they knew was that it was a bit gusty at their destination, and scorching hot. Many of the passengers wouldn't even be entering Dubai, however. They would just be waiting in the airport for the next flight. So the weather would be irrelevant for them, they figured. The captain entered into the flight management system the plane's flap configuration and touchdown speed. Flight 521 would be landing with flaps 30, a final approach speed of 152 knots, and a touchdown speed of 147 knots. The pilots were given the latest wind information, which had them touching down with a 13-knot tailwind. This was just below their limit of 15 knots, but even though it was close to the allowable limit, it didn't pose a threat to safety. Dubai has a very long runway, measuring 12,000 feet, and both pilots were well accustomed to landing there. But wind shear from a sea breeze wasn't the only problem the pilots were anticipating on landing. The temperature at Dubai on this afternoon was a staggering 48 degrees Celsius. That's 118 degrees in American English. The problem with temperatures like this is that pockets of heat known as thermals begin bubbling up from the hot ground, especially from surfaces which heat quickly, like runways and taxiways. This can itself cause wind shear, and even when it doesn't, it can threaten the stability of an aircraft on final approach. Despite how practiced they were, the pilots would need to keep their wits about them on this approach to Dubai. As they descended, they began discussing their previous encounters with wind shear. The first officer said that he had experienced it on descent 3 months previously, and the captain added that he had experienced it 2 months previously, in June, but that it turned out well as they had just carried out a go-round as normal. But as is often the case when humans interact with complex systems, it is not a singular factor like maintaining control of the plane in a wind shear event that posed the biggest threat here. Rather, it was the particular and unforeseen ways in which different elements would coincide, creating a problem where one didn't even need to exist. In this case, the main problem had not to do with the weather, but with how the pilots had been trained to use the plane's automation. The crew pressed on, getting ready for their approach to runway 12 left. As helpful as it is to have up-to-date weather information from the airport's weather instruments, pilots often rely on reports from other pilots to get a sense of the real conditions as they approach an airport. This would have been especially useful on this afternoon. As Flight 521 descended, an Iraqi Airways Boeing 737 had landed on runway 12 left, with the pilots reporting light to medium wind shear on short final. A few minutes after that, 2 planes ahead of Flight 521 had gone around due to the wind. However, because they were on the Dubai Tower frequency rather than the approach frequency, the pilots of Flight 521 were not aware of this. What's more, the pilots of these planes didn't tell the controllers why they had carried out missed approaches. As a result, the controllers didn't tell Flight 521 that multiple aircraft were now going around due to wind shear. What this meant was that the pilots now had an incomplete picture of the situation at the airport. Nonetheless, pilots are supposed to be ready for a missed approach for every landing they do, and the pilots of Flight 521 had briefed this procedure for runway 12 left earlier on, which involved, among other things, climbing to 3,000 feet. Within a few minutes, Flight 521 was handed off to Dubai Tower. In front of them were 2 777s, which landed without any issue. The aircraft was now just over 1 minute from the runway. The pilots lowered the landing gear, armed the spoilers on the wings, and set the flaps to 30 degrees. Spoilers are panels on the wings that pop up when the plane touches down. They're extremely useful in helping the plane to slow down, because not only do they dramatically reduce the amount of lift that the wings produce, but by deflecting the fast oncoming air upwards, they push the plane down onto the runway, making the wheel brakes more effective. By putting the speed brakes in the armed position, the pilots had ensured that when the wheels touch down, or more specifically, when weight is detected on the main wheel sensors, the speed brake handle automatically moves to the fully extended position without the pilots needing to do anything. With the landing gear down and locked, speed brakes armed, and flaps set, the 777 was fully set up for landing. The first officer set the missed approach altitude of 3,000 feet on the autopilot panel, both as a reminder of what the missed approach altitude was, and so it would already be set for the autopilot to climb to if they used it for a missed approach. The controller cleared Flight 521 to land, and instructed them to exit the runway via taxiway Mike 9 after landing. The controller also gave them a wind report of 340 degrees at 11 knots. 340 degrees was behind the pilots, so they now knew that they would be landing with a tailwind. However, 11 knots was still within safe limits. Their tailwind limit was 15 knots. But what neither the pilots nor the controller knew was that as Flight 521 approached the runway, the sea breeze front had reached the middle of the runway. So, while there was a tailwind at the touchdown zone for runway 12 left, at the other end of the runway, there was a headwind. These two winds met right in the middle of the runway, and this was about to play a crucial role in what would now happen. At 38 minutes past 12, the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet. The captain turned the autopilot off and began flying manually towards the runway. He left the auto throttle engaged though, in case he wanted to use it for a go-round. The auto throttle was in speed mode, set to maintain the desired approach speed of 152 knots. When the aircraft was just a few feet above the runway, the engines would switch to idle. So far, the approach was, in industry jargon, stabilised, meaning that the captain was flying no more than 5 knots below his target approach speed, or no more than 10 knots above, that he was within half a dot of the glide path, and descending at less than 1,000 feet per minute. Neither pilot was expecting to carry out a go-round. They had heard wind shear warnings many times in Dubai's weather reports without actually encountering it. And besides, they had heard no reports from controllers of any aircraft carrying out missed approaches or encountering wind shear. In the pilots' minds, the more likely issue would come from thermals, with the runway temperature now a scorching 68 degrees Celsius or 154 degrees Fahrenheit. Things could get a little bumpy as they approached the airport, as pockets of warm air bubbled up from the surface. When they reached 400 feet above the ground, the aircraft's computerized voice called out minimums, telling the pilots that they were now at their decision height. The captain announced landing. The captain was now switching his attention between the runway out his windscreen and his instruments. The first officer was looking inside, ensuring that the plane remained stabilized. It was his job to offer corrections if necessary, or warn if anything unusual occurred. And indeed, as they descended through 190 feet, the first officer called 16 knots tailwind. He was telling the captain that the tailwind strength had increased beyond their limit of 15 knots. But seconds later, he announced that the tailwind had decreased to 13 knots, which the captain acknowledged. They were back on track to land. The plane was now just 100 feet above the ground.
100.
The captain was aiming for the large white strips here, which marked the beginning of the touchdown zone. But the wind had other things in store for Flight 521. The tailwind was getting weaker, causing the plane's airspeed to increase. With more air now going over the wings, they generated more lift. This, in turn, made the plane's descent more shallow. As the aircraft descended through 50 feet, its computers disabled several warnings, because at this point, pilots are committed to landing. Importantly, among the warnings disabled was the wind shear alert. At 40 feet above the runway, the captain started to flare the aircraft by lifting the nose up just enough to slow the plane's descent for a smooth landing. Ideally, he would have begun this flare about 20 to 30 feet above the runway, rather than at 40 feet. But an extra 10 feet usually isn't a big deal. However, this wasn't about to be a usual landing. As the headwind continued getting stronger, the plane's airspeed kept increasing. Again, to distinguish between airspeed and ground speed, airspeed is what makes a plane fly. If a plane is standing still on a runway and the wind is blowing towards it at 10 knots, its airspeed is 10 knots, even though its ground speed is 0. More headwind means more airspeed, which means more lift, which means a slower descent. Flight 521 now began to float less than 30 feet above the runway, coasting right over the 1,000 foot markers, the point where it should have touched down. The plane's airspeed had now increased to 158 knots, 11 knots above its target approach speed. As it neared the runway, the autothrottle went from speed mode to idle mode, and the engines moved back towards idle. At just 13 feet above the runway, the headwind suddenly got stronger. But the pilots weren't paying attention to their airspeed, and they didn't notice this. This headwind pushed the plane's airspeed up to 165 knots, 18 knots above its target touchdown speed. This was wind shear. But because the aircraft was below 50 feet, the wind shear warning didn't sound. With the aircraft now barely descending, the pilots were under the mistaken impression that they were encountering thermals, hot pockets of air rising up from the runway. The plane was now barely 10 feet above the runway, with the main wheels gliding along, just waiting to make contact with the ground. Every second that the plane stayed flying, it ate up precious runway that it could be using to land and stop. The runway behind it was getting longer and longer, and the runway ahead of it shorter and shorter. But now, this already bad state of affairs was about to get a lot worse. In the next few seconds, an incredibly unfortunate series of events was about to unfold, which would endanger the lives of everyone on board the flight. The wind suddenly shifted, causing the plane to roll slightly to the left. To correct this, the captain rolled the plane back to the right. But the plane was now so low to the ground that this simple input caused the right main wheels to touch the ground. When this happened, the speed brakes deployed, before quickly retracting back to their armed position as soon as the gear lifted off again. So soft was this contact that the pilots didn't even know they had touched the ground. Buoyed by an ever-increasing headwind, the plane seemed completely unwilling to touch down. The captain lowered the nose, trying to bring his plane onto the runway, but it simply kept on floating. The captain was experiencing tunnel vision. If he had looked at his radio altimeter, he would have seen that he was mere feet above the ground. All he needed to do was to give the control column one more nudge forwards, and the plane would settle on the runway. But his attention was outside. Suddenly, the plane sent out a warning.
Long landing, long landing.
This told the pilots that they had flown more than 33% down the runway, well past the point where they should have touched down. This warning meant that the pilots had to go around. The captain pressed the toga button, telling the autothrottle to advance the throttles to go round power. He still believed that hot air rising up from the runway had prevented him from touching down. Without any reports of wind shear from air traffic control or other pilots, this wasn't exactly a far-fetched conclusion, but the fact was that the massive increases in airspeed which showed up on his instruments could only have come from wind shear. Nonetheless, operating under this false impression, the captain now began carrying out the normal go-around procedure, rather than the wind shear escape maneuver. And this was where a gap in the pilot's training would now come into play. while the captain had conducted 54 go-arounds at an altitude of at least 50 feet above the ground in the simulator, neither he nor the first officer had ever conducted a go-around below 50 feet, in the sim or in real life. This was simply a scenario that they were not familiar with. And the reason this mattered was that a critical safety feature in the 777's automation would now lay a trap for the pilots. They didn't know that during their landing attempt, both main wheels had touched the ground twice. When this happened, the toga switch, the switch the captain would then use to command the autothrottle to provide go-around thrust, was disabled. Boeing had cleverly designed it this way to prevent pilots from carrying out a go-around when they were already on the ground. This feature was noted, though not very well, in the pilot's training manual. However, during the captain's initial and recurrent training, it was not emphasized. What all of this meant was that when he pressed the toga button, the throttles stayed right where they were, at idle. As far as the plane was concerned, it was landing. And as far as the pilots were concerned, they were going around. The captain pulled back on his control column, and the plane began climbing. Neither pilot noticed that their engine instruments very clearly showed the engines to be at idle. They also didn't notice on their primary flight displays that the autothrottle was still in idle mode, when it should have been at toga. And in the heat of the moment, the captain didn't even notice that in his right hand, the throttles themselves hadn't moved forwards. They were still back at the idle position. Flight 521 was now climbing away from the runway, bleeding off speed rapidly. As part of the go-around procedure, the first officer raised the flaps to 20 degrees. As they climbed past 50 feet, he announced positive rate, and the captain retracted the landing gear. Even between raising the flaps and the gear, the two pilots still didn't notice that the engine instruments showed idle thrust. What's more, raising the gear made their speed problem even worse. In a normal go-around, which the pilots were carrying out, raising the gear was fine. But in a wind shear escape maneuver, which the pilots should have been doing, they were supposed to keep the gear extended. This is because when the gear is raised, the landing gear doors first open, increasing the amount of drag experienced by the aircraft at a time when it really needs as little drag as possible so they can get away from the ground. But again, the pilots didn't know that they should have been carrying out the wind shear escape maneuver. In other words, it wasn't just that they were doing the right procedure but in the wrong way. They were doing the wrong procedure and they were doing it wrong. They were doing a go-round with the engines on idle. In the cabin, the passengers and cabin crew were completely oblivious to what was now unfolding in the cockpit. It was clear that the plane was beginning a go-round, but they were no more clued in than the pilots that the engines were at idle. The plane continued to trundle uphill, running out of speed. Passing 77 feet, its ground speed had now decreased to 135 knots. Unless the pilots did something fast, they would soon come crashing back down to Earth. In the tower, the controllers saw that the plane had aborted its landing attempt, and instructed the crew to climb up to 4,000 feet. The first officer acknowledged this, and for a precious few moments that he could have used to notice that the engines were still at idle thrust, he changed the autopilot altitude to 4,000 feet. As the lumbering plane got slower, it began to approach the biggest danger yet, an aerodynamic stall. This happens when the air approaches the wings from such an angle that rather than flowing smoothly over their upper surface, it breaks off, essentially disconnecting the plane from the sky. At 85 feet above the runway, and at a speed of 131 knots, the plane's computers warned them of this fact. This caught their attention. How the pilots processed this information would be crucial. Because this was the first time during the go-round that they were even paying attention to the plane's speed, they assumed that it had been fine up until this point, and that they had only now suddenly lost a lot of speed. And what could be the culprit for such a sudden change in airspeed? Wind shear, of course. Wind shear toga, the captain called. Ironically, the pilots were wrong again. Their low speed had nothing to do with wind shear. In fact, if anything, the headwind they were now experiencing was giving them an extra few knots. Rather, their low speed had to do with the fact that they had tried to make the plane climb with the engines at idle. With barely enough speed to stay in the air, Flight 521 began sinking.
Don't sink.
Finally, at this late stage, the pilots realized to their horror that the throttles had been at idle the entire time. The captain slammed them to maximum power and then pushed the toga button again just to be sure. The autothrottle mode was now at toga, but it was much too late. It's a design feature of jet engines that they don't spool up immediately when full power is commanded, as doing so would disrupt the flow of air over the fan blades, causing them to stall. Therefore, the 777's engines take at least 6 seconds to go from idle to full power. And with the plane now descending towards the runway from just 80 feet, this was 6 seconds it simply didn't have. "Check speed," shouted the first officer, seeing how low the airspeed was. The flight computer chimed in with its own alert. But it was too late. Just 18 seconds after the pilots had decided to go around, and 3 seconds after they finally applied full power, the 777 slammed onto the runway. The impact sheared the right engine completely off, along with the right landing gear, which had not finished retracting. The plane skidded on its belly and left engine, spun completely around, and went off the side of the runway. It finally came to rest at the end of the runway, with fire erupting from the right wing. Rescue vehicles raced to the scene as fire began to engulf the aircraft. The first of the fire trucks arrived at the scene within 90 seconds, and the firefighters quickly started dousing the plane with foam. It was pandemonium on board the aircraft, as the nearly 300 passengers began rushing to evacuate through the few emergency exits which could actually be used. Only 3 out of the 10 exits were usable, with the others being blocked by smoke or by the emergency chutes themselves, which had been blown up against the exits by the wind. In all, it took almost 7 minutes until the last passenger was off, compared to the 90 seconds which is required by law. The captain and senior cabin crew member were the last ones on board, making their way through the smoky cabin on oxygen, looking for any remaining passengers in the burning aircraft. When suddenly, as they searched, the center wing tank exploded. This sent a piece of the right wing flying off, which hit a firefighter, killing him. The senior cabin crew member and captain then quickly evacuated. In all, everybody on board the aircraft survived, with 4 cabin crew sustaining serious injuries from when the aircraft impacted the runway. The crash was the first hull loss and fatal accident for Emirates, and it came as a huge shock to the airline and the industry itself. It revealed that lessons about pilots' understanding of automation had still not been learned from the crash of another 777 at San Francisco 3 years previously. You can watch my video about that incident here now, using the link appearing on the top right of the screen. As a result of the crash, Emirates began training its pilots on how to carry out go-rounds after touchdown, rather than just from heights above 50 feet. It also altered its simulator training, so that instructors acting as pilot flying make small mistakes, in order to see whether the pilot monitoring notices these mistakes and calls them out. Air traffic controllers at Dubai now pass on information about wind shear to pilots, including reports from other pilots about how much speed they gained or lost during landing attempts as a result of wind shear. They also now tell arriving aircraft the reason that other planes have gone around. Crashes like that of Flight 521 highlight a kind of paradox of automation. On one hand, increased automation makes pilots' lives easier by lightening their workload and allowing them to focus on the bigger picture. This is especially important at high workload moments of flight. On the other hand, the more complex automation gets, the harder it is for pilots to understand and predict it. What this means for air safety is that planes crash less often, but they crash for different reasons. This problem of the interaction between man and machine is only bound to get more relevant over the coming years, as aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus strive to design ever more advanced automation for their aircraft.